Good evening, everyone. My name is David Ellwood. I'm the Dean here at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Junior Forum. We're very excited to have a spectacular group of people up here this evening to talk about a topic that seems to have suddenly gotten some attention again. And so we're pleased. Larry Katz was laughing that he only gets called to the forum when someone's occupying at Harvard. The last time was during the labor movements, the living wage and so forth. So we're glad that Larry has instigated once again a reason to be here. I want to welcome you all here. It's a very important and exciting topic. I also particularly want to welcome our president, Drew Faust, who's here with Charles Rosenberg, her husband, and also a professor in the history of science as well as the social sciences, and many others. This is a wonderful evening to have. Imagine, if you will, a ladder. And the ladder is the ladder of wealth. And let's say the first rung is at $1 million. So in fact, every rung is $1 million of wealth. So 1 foot per $1 million. Got it? So the question is, where are you on that rung? And it turns out, you know, if you look, most Americans, overwhelming Americans, are well below the first rung. Many of them are not even off the ground. Half are maybe an inch or two off the ground. But a few are $1 million, you know, in the first rung. Some might be 2, 3, even 5. You might even think of some really wealthy people that might be on the 100th rung, 100 feet up. Bill Gates is 12 miles up. We're here to talk about inequality. And by the way, just since it's much in the news and so forth to talk about the top 1%, you might ask yourself, okay, Bill Gates is 12 miles up. A lot of people are an inch up. Where do you think the 1 percentile of wealth starts? Well, the first problem with this is we don't know how to measure wealth very well, and we don't actually collect it, and there's a dozen ways in which you can measure and so forth. But generally speaking, with a reasonable range of estimates from low to high would be in the range of 5 to 10 rungs up is where the 1% start. So one of the things that I want us to be sure and emphasize, because I think it's been a problem in the current debate, is that there's actually inequality could be maybe broken broadly into 3 categories. One is the poor, the people that are largely disenfranchised, who they maybe cross the official poverty threshold, or they're mired in central cities, whatever. That may be the bottom 15 to 20%, something like that. Then there's this range between, say, the 15th to the 99th. And that's the vast majority, obviously, of all Americans. And there, too, inequality has been growing, and there have been issues and so forth, and we can talk about that. And then there's this top 1%. It's really probably the top half of 1% that are the very, very super wealthy. And it's very important to distinguish those 3 categories to really understand what's going on. And my fear is if we focus on just one, either the bottom or the top or whatever, we miss some of the most important forces that are shaping our lives and our futures and this very sense of the American dream. So we have a very distinguished panel here to speak on this. I must say it's especially exciting for me. Poverty and social policy has been largely my work until I became dean, in which case I ceased all work. But I had the opportunity to work on welfare reform during the Clinton administration, and so it's fascinating to watch as things develop. So our speakers will go in this following order. Larry Katz is seated to my immediate left. Larry is kind of the person anyone should turn to or call just to understand what the facts are, understand what's happening. He is probably the premier person who's talked and tried to understand the causes of shifting patterns of inequality, but also labor markets more broadly. He's done a great deal of work on education. He's a co-author of the Race Between Education and Technology, which is a history of U.S. economic inequality. He's studied neighborhood poverty. He's a mentor to all of us. He's evaluated the Moving to Opportunity program and dozens of other things. It's wonderful to have him here. He's a professor of economics up in the Yard. Next to him is Kathy Eden, who's a professor of public policy and management here at the Kennedy School. She's also chair of the multidisciplinary program in inequality and social policy. She is also someone to whom I constantly turn for insights and ideas. Indeed, not so long ago, she completely caused me to rethink how I think about lone parent families, which has been a big part of her research. She does. She largely focuses on social anthropology kinds of activities. She's a qualitative researcher, really tries to understand, spends her times in the neighborhoods. Her next book, which she's doing with Tim Nelson here, is Doing the Best I Can, Fatherhood in the Inner City. It's based on 8 years of research with white and black low-income fathers living in neighborhoods in Philadelphia, Camden, New Jersey. She's the author of an enormous number of things, and she's current project includes a study of 150 youth living in the Baltimore Housing Project. She's, throughout the years, again, been one of the most thoughtful and effective voices on it all. Next to her is William Julius Wilson. I'm running out of superlatives, but of all the superlatives, in some ways, Bill deserves the greatest of superlatives. If there were a Nobel Prize in sociology, he would have received it long ago. He is not only the kind of person whose ideas are stimulating, about every 5 years, he resets the entire agenda. His work on ghetto poverty, on concentrated poverty in our inner cities, is truly remarkable. He's the Louis P. and Linda L. Geiser University professor at Harvard and director of the Joblessness and Urban Poverty Research Program here at the Wiener Center at the Kennedy School. His books include The Truly Disadvantaged, When Work Disappears, The World of the New Urban Poor, The Bridge Over the Racial Divide, Rising Inequality and Coalition Politics, and more recently he's written More Than Just Race, Being Black and Poor in the Inner City. And finally, we have Ed Glazer, who's the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics, also in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. He recently was named one of the top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. And so I keep telling him he should be a doer too, but that's only because I'm jealous. He is the director of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government and the director of the Rapport Institute for Greater Boston. He specializes in urban and social economics and microtheory. He's, again, in the superlatives, he is the person that thinks, the economist who focuses on urban issues, urban policy, and so forth. His recent book, Triumph of the City, is truly spectacular, and I really urge all of you to take a look. So it's a all-star lineup, and let me just start. We're going to try and have as lively a discussion as we can. But I hope by the end we'll have talked a little bit about what's happening in inequality, but not too much on that, why it's happening, whether and why we should care, and most importantly, whether we have any serious ideas of something to do about it. So with that, I'm going to start with Larry and ask, so has inequality really been growing, and what's going on?
Okay. I think the answer is certainly yes. Any way you slice or dice data on income, earnings, or wealth, one has seen large increases in inequality over the last 30 years after a period of broadly shared prosperity in the US from World War II to the 1970s. And there are really two major components of the growth of inequality that are a little bit separate. The first is what's gotten a lot of attention recently, which is really the upper 0.5%, not the top 1%. But if you think of it in the top 1%, the share of national income going to the top 1% basically more than doubled from 1979 to the present, from about 10% to about 23.5%. So that is a huge change. And to put it in perspective, if magically we could have kept the share of income of the top 1% where it was in 1979 and redistributed costlessly all that income to the bottom 90%, everyone would have $9,000 more dollars, or about 27% higher income. So in the context of slowdown and growth, that's pretty big. That's sort of over a decade of normal growth for the bottom 90%. So this is very large quantitatively. But there's also another, even if we throw away, and that's largely driven by the top 0.5%, even if we throw away the upper 1% and look at the bottom 99 or bottom 99.5, there are very large increases in inequality, and it's particularly associated with growing gaps between the college educated and non-college educated. The college high school wage gap, more than doubled from 1979 to the present. And to put in context how large these education gaps are relative to the top 1%, if you were a full-time, full-year worker with a college degree, your income gap relative to someone with a high school degree for a male grew by $20,000 from 1979 to the present, and for females by about $13,000. So for a two-parent family where both are working full year, that's over $30,000 gap as compared to the $9,000 from the top 1%. So while the top 1% is incredibly important, there's a lot going on in the bottom 99.5% as well, and about 2/3 of the growth of inequality in the bottom 99.5% is associated with this education gradient, and most of the other is in fact growing inequality among the highly educated, even throwing out the very top. So someone who went to Harvard is doing much better today relative to someone who went to UMass Boston. Someone who left Harvard and went into finance relative to someone who left Harvard and went into teaching is doing much, much better economically than they were in the past. And those two components really are the very big part. And the third thing I just want to note is there's no way you can make this go away by stories about, well, the top end's done really well, but it's sort of a transitory state. It's not true. First of all, most people who are BAs are not high school dropouts one day and a BA the next day, so you certainly can't make the education thing go away. That's a pretty permanent status. But even if you look at the very top, the way I like to think of it is it goes back to Edward Bellamy and Looking Backward, where he talked about a coach and the first class section versus the lower parts of the coaches, thinking of the economy, or today you could think of airplanes, but I think of it as an apartment building. What's basically happened over the last 30 years is that the penthouse has gotten really, really nice. The basement has flooded, and it's full of cockroaches now that it didn't used to have. The middle units have pretty much stayed the same, but the elevator up to the top end is becoming more difficult to get on. It's true that some people born in the penthouse fall out and end up a couple floors below, and it's true some people escape the upper parts of the middle and end up in the penthouse, but that's always been true. But where you're born and where you start out economically is much more important, much bigger differences than before. The gap between the penthouse and the middle and the bottom is very much a permanent income thing. Even though there's a bunch of volatility, the volatility of people moving around hasn't changed very much. And so these are largely permanent differences, and where you're born, where you start out really matters.
So Larry, you told us something about what causes the differences in the middle group, large middle group, but help me understand this huge growth in the upper half of 1%.
Sure. So the way I try to think of it, there's sort of broad economic forces that are long-term. Economic development has led to large technological changes that have favored more educated workers. That's been going on for more than 100 years. It was true in the mid-20th century. It was true in the period after World War II, where one saw very balanced growth, even though there was increasing demand for executives, for financial executives. One of the big differences in the bottom 99.5% is we really expanded access to education over much of the 20th century, and that's really slowed down, reducing competition for people at the very upper end. So there's sort of forces of education, forces of technology, there are forces of globalization. All those play out in pretty much every rich country, but not every rich country has had as large an increase in inequality at the very upper end as the US. Other English-speaking countries have. Britain has, Australia somewhat, Canada not so much. Continental Europe hasn't. So you need to look beyond just those economic forces, and clearly tax policy, clearly the degree to which financial markets have been deregulated have played an important pattern. The huge growth at the upper end came after substantial cuts in top-end taxes at the start of the Reagan administration, similar things in the Thatcher administration in Britain, and there's strong cross-country and time series evidence that suggests when top-end tax rates are reduced, it's much more valuable if you're a top-end executive to spend your time expanding your income and negotiating with your board over it, and that certainly played a role. There are also potentially real labor supply responses. Those seem much more moderate. We don't seem to be getting great growth benefits from cutting taxes at the very top end, but there are large rent-seeking benefits. Financial deregulation and the globalization of financial markets and the ability to take risks that have been fairly opaque clearly have played a role. If you look at who are in the top 0.1 and 0.5%, they're dominated by executives of non-financial corporations and increasingly by people in finance. There's a tail of lawyers and doctors, superstar entertainers, and superstars play some role, but it's the mix of global finance and top-end executives who often don't face as much scrutiny in their pay and changes in norms. In countries with less of a decline in top-end tax rates, with some different norms of top-end pay, have seen pressures in this direction, but not as large as the U.S.
Let me just follow up on that last thing, and then I want to move on to the next, which is, how much of this do you think is norms? Just a different attitude that it's okay if you're at the very top, and have they always had the capacity to command that level, and it just wasn't appropriate, or do you think this is really more understood as a set of policy and or economic forces?
I think it's an interaction of the two. I think there is strong demand for talent at the top end in corporations. They are larger. Being slightly better, there's an economic force. If you're making decisions worth, several $billion to a company, even being 1% better is worth a lot of money if you can capture part of that. So part of it is a better decision for a $100 billion company is more valuable than for a $10 billion company. But much of it is, you used to not have to motivate a person by capturing the full 1% to make that better decision. I don't think we need to. I think making $10 million more rather than $20 million more, you would still try to make a good decision. So some of it is the reduced tax rate, the sort of rat race element of the top, prestige, and you certainly see this in some of the scandals where people making millions of dollars as a McKinsey, partner look at people making tens of millions of dollars as, top, hedge fund and private equity guys and want to do things that you probably wouldn't have seen them do 30 years ago. Not, I think, because of their marginal propensity to consume from 100 million is that different, but because of the norms and status.
Bill.
I'd like to weigh in here and really reinforce, not contradict my economist friend. You mentioned 1947 to 1970 as a period in which all boats.
Rising tide lifted all boats.
Absolutely.
Right. In fact, poor families recorded higher income growth in annual real income than other families. That was a really unique period. Now, what is unique about the 1950s and 60s is that government policies, social as well as economic policies, were integral to the gains experienced by all groups. I just wanted to highlight that. Low-wage workers, for example, gained from a wide range of protections, including steady increases in the minimum wage, which I think you mentioned that. The government made tight labor markets a high priority. There was also a strong union movement that ensured higher wages and non-wage benefits for ordinary Americans. However, in the 1970s and 1980s, things moved in a different direction for lower wage workers. The union movement began its downward spiral. Macroeconomic policy was no longer geared toward tight labor markets. That might be putting it somewhat strongly, but monetary policy became dominant and was focused on defeating inflation above all else, and therefore the fate of the working poor rarely was discussed in those situations when the Federal Reserve Board, worried about the possibility of rising inflation, raised interest rates to slow down the economy. And then you mentioned, the Reagan experiment, which resulted in a change in the tax structure, and then furthermore, congressional resistance to raising the minimum wage and expanding the earned income tax credit threatened the economic security of disadvantaged families. So I think that we should make that comparison. In addition to the things that you pointed out, I think we should also look at these economic and social policies of the government compared to back from 1947, say roughly 1970.
Yeah, it is interesting. The rising tide lifting all boats was certainly something that happened throughout until the 70s. Starting in the 70s, it started to spread out, but the really extreme 1% part is much more of a recent phenomenon, although it's always been there. So it's an interesting set of combinations. I don't know, Ed, I've noticed you nodding. Do you want to get in here, or do you want?
Well, I think, you know, it's I've just been thinking about the very strong and I think quite understandable language that I just heard. And I think that as an economist, many of these policies are ones that it's really hard to imagine that we would introduce today and they would have wildly beneficial results. I mean, it's hard to take the case that actually a massive increase in the minimum wage would be something that would be, at least not without very significant consequences, that wouldn't be all that attractive. But in some sense, I think about the tragedy of what happened in the 70s and the 80s, and I think it really was a tragedy. It's not just that we abandoned these sort of workplace regulations, but that we also lost the commitment to raising every American through education. We stopped this remarkable experiment that starts in Iowa, moves along with the GI Bill, of sort of making sure that human capital is distributed throughout this country so that people can take advantage of the labor markets, not because of some ex post rigging of the wage system, but rather because they actually have the productivity, the skills to actually participate in the global economy. And at least that's as I think about it, what to me feels most tragic about the ball that was dropped during the 70s and 80s, is that we didn't accompany a move towards somewhat less regulation in certain areas with a simultaneous commitment to the human capital of every American.
Ed, how do you think about this top 1% issue, top half percent?
You know, I'm mostly interested in the top 1% in the sense that they can help us pay for the bottom 15%, right? I'm not interested in punitive taxes one way or the other, but although I do share a sincere interest in the extent to which the 1% is getting rich because they're taking risks with costs that they're not internalizing. I mean, for standard reasons, that certainly I agree with. But my primary interest is in making sure that the human capital distribution is better spread and that the people at the bottom end of the distribution are having a fairer, brighter future.
Kathy, you've focused on one of the other huge forces that's reshaping this, and that's the changing nature of families and what is like. What can you add here?
Well, as you said, I spend most of my time talking with people in their homes rather than looking at numbers, but I do moonlight as a demographer. And I'm going to make 3 points, and at the end there'll be a test. So we'll see how you do. First, and some of you may know this and some of you may not, there's a large and growing class divide in family life. So the families of the college-educated and the non-college educated, I'm going to call them the haves and the have-nots, have never been more unequal. This is true in divorce. Middle-class people now divorce less as less often as they did in the 1960s, whereas divorces for the bottom end are growing. Non-marital childbearing barely moved among college-educated women, grown dramatically among those without a college education. And I'm going to argue that these trends in family structure have led to diverging destinies for the kids of the haves and the have-nots that are likely to have really troubling implications for the future. So that's point 1. Now, point 2 is that the growing class divide in family structure is part of what's driving inequality. So let's take non-marital childbearing as an example. Today, 41% of all children are born outside of marriage. Non-marital childbearing is highly concentrated, as I said earlier, among the have-nots. Now, this may not matter very much if parents who had children in these situations had stable situations. Let's say they lived with a mother who was stably single. Kids love stability. That might be okay. Let's say they lived with 2 unmarried parents who were together but just didn't have a marriage license. That would probably also be okay. But neither is the case. First, there are no stably single mothers. Only 4% of children born outside of marriage today will live with a mother that's stably single for the first 5 years of their lives. And only 30% will have parents who actually stay together over that first 5 years. The rest, 3 in 4, will face family lives that are unstable. Their parents will break up, and they'll quickly repartner, and often complex families. For these parents will often have subsequent children by these new partners. Now, as someone who spends lots of time in low-income neighborhoods among such families, I can attest to the fact that this makes kids' and parents' lives very, very complicated. Now, I want to just give you a picture of what this looks like. And we're going to start with Jill Have. I'm going to paint a mental picture of a typical child born to a married couple living in a large city in 2000. So over the first 5 years of Jill's life, she has about a 20% chance of seeing her parents break up. Now, once that happens, she may have to adjust to a new stepmother or a new stepfather. But often, these relationships will be lasting. Sometimes she may also have to adjust to a new half-sibling. But overall, she faces a less than 25% chance of living in an unstable or complex family during the first 5 years of her life. Let's contrast Jill's situation with that of Bill. We'll call him Bill Have Not. Okay, he is a typical child born to an unmarried couple in 2000. Now, by his 5th birthday, Bill has a 70% chance of seeing his parents break. About half the time, Bill will have to adjust to a new man in his mom's life by the age of 5. And about half the time, he'll have to adjust to a new woman in his dad's life. Unlike Jill, most of these new parental relationships will not last, and Bill's parents may continue to repartner. Of course, that's not all. Bill has a 60% chance of having at least one half-sibling by the age of 5. In fact, he has a nearly 25% chance of having more than 3 half-siblings by that age. Often, these are from multiple new relationships, not just one. So when we put this all together, the instability and the complexity, Bill has an almost 80% chance of living in a family characterized by instability, complexity, or both. And he has a nearly 50% chance of living in a family that is both unstable and complex. Now, these data are fairly new, and the research base is still thin, but so far, research suggests there may be far-reaching, very negative implications for kids' well-being, especially for boys. Now, here's point 3. Point 2 is a little long. I apologize. Here's the irony. When you talk to unmarried parents at the hospital when they welcome their children into the world, most desperately want to stay together and raise their children together. Most even rate their chances of marrying each other as better than even. Some do eventually marry, about 18%, but what happens to them economically over the first 5 years of that child's life matters a lot. Couples who become poor, for example, are only half as likely to marry as couples who do not. And economic gains are associated with higher marriage rates. Acquiring a home, a key part of the American dream, is associated with a 3-fold increase in marriage among unmarried couples. When you hang out with poor couples in low-income communities, you'll hear couples say that it wouldn't be right, it wouldn't be moral to marry unless they've achieved some sort of economic stability, freedom from welfare, a mortgage on a modest row house, a little bit in the bank, and at least one steady job between them. If you follow couples over time, you'll find that when they make even modest economic gains, their chances of marriage and thus staying together and raising their children together increase substantially. So, to review, there's a growing class divide in family life. Second, this is part of what's driving rising inequality. And third, for the have-nots like Bill, what happens to his parents economically over the first 5 years in his life matter a lot for the kind of family he'll grow up in. If their fortunes improve, Bill's chances of living a life like Jill's also improve. But if they decline, the risk of this family instability and complexity that we suspect is associated with negative outcomes for kids' life chances is extraordinarily high.
Thank you, Ken. And I guess I think it's worth adding that remember the fertility rates overall for people in this in your have group, the upper half, whatever, are falling. They're declining. They're less than reproduction. fertility rates so the workforce of the future is the very group you're talking about. They are
That's
the people who will be doing the work in the future. So it's even if you're just focused on the larger economy. Bill, this is also a topic you've spent much of your life working on and exploring. I don't know if you wanted to add anything here, but partly I'd like to hear anybody's additional reasons why we should care about this growing inequality. But more importantly, what are we going to do about it? What can you really do? I mean, we've got people in Occupy Boston, Harvard, and whatever else. They've scrupulously avoided making demands of a large sort, big policy changes and so forth. But suppose they came to you and said, I want to change inequality in America. What should we do? Bill?
Well, the question is, what can we do realistically, given the present economic and political climate? And certainly I would love to strengthen the nation's equalizing institutions. It's what Frank Levy calls equalizing. The economist Frank Levy calls equalizing institutions. Institutions that I think played a major role in the broadly rising economic increases in economic income, among all groups, situation where the poor experienced a more rapid increase in inequality, and more rapid increase in income than the top 1/5 of the population. So when I think of equalizing institutions, I'm thinking about quality public schools. I'm thinking about the welfare state broadly defined, which would include, of course, the health care legislation. I'm thinking about the minimum wage increases. Ed said that, certainly increases in the minimum wage may have consequences. Economists certainly have argued over the years that increases in the minimum wage ultimately will lead to more unemployment. And then you had the economists at Princeton, Kruger, arguing the opposite. But I think overwhelmingly mainstream economists resist the idea of increasing the minimum wage. But nonetheless, if you look back to this period where there was rising, or all boats, rising tide did indeed lift all boats. If you look at that period, the minimum wage did increase fairly regularly over a period of several years. It was a regular increase in the minimum wage. And so what I'm talking about is that how can we strengthen the nation's equalizing institutions so that we can stem or at least slow down the rise of inequality in our society. And I know that's a difficult undertaking given the present situation that we have in this country.
Larry, you want to?
Okay. So, the way I think of it is, inequality eventually gets, caused by an interaction of market forces, the supply and demand of different types of workers in particular and skill groups that interact with a set of institutions that can be equalizing or can, help benefit the top end. And we certainly have, we're not going to do anything that really is going to change the long-run chains of technology, the growing globalization that is going to, continue to, basically what we have seen is a substantial, what I would say, polarization of labor demand. There's big growth for top-end abstract skills, creativity, which is sort of the upper hand of college and beyond. There's lots of growth for in-person services, which can't be outsourced. Computers are not yet very good at empathy. They don't know how to change a bed or pick up garbage, drive a taxi cab yet, although that may come. So they've done a lot to displace what used to be traditional middle-class jobs, whether it's middle management, standard engineering positions, high-end production jobs, in the same way that changes in agricultural productivity eliminated. In the past, we got out of there by the high school movement, educating people in the new sets of skills much more broadly to take advantage of the new economy. So I think, demand is going to shift, but we need to expand the supply. So over the long haul, early childhood education being more accessible and more high quality will be important. K through 12 schooling, and then making sure people who are ready for college actually can go and have the types of courses they need. Investing in our community college system, which is highly rationed now in the types of courses they do, is first order in the long haul. In the short to medium term, we need to do much more to support the wages of workers in the middle and the bottom. And I think an expanded earned income tax credit to try to create, when there are jobs, since we now have a work-based sort of safety net more, would be quite important to allow people to have a chance of escaping the family situations that Kathy thought about. So we need a more progressive tax system at the upper end to use. As I said, I don't think people, if they can only make $5 million for a good decision as opposed to $10 million, aren't going to make that good decision and aren't going to put out the effort. It's not punitive. It's sort of, we need a broad tax base at the upper end and somewhat higher rates to have the revenue, to have a stronger earned income tax credit, and to invest in human capital. And we need to at least have the ability of workers to organize without as strong threats, against them. I don't think we're going to change very much the role of unions in traded goods sectors. I think it's just not going to happen, and I don't think the future is of manufacturing unions, laws of employment. But in in-person service sectors, types of businesses that cannot sort of go overseas, you're not going to ship your parents to India for long-term care, or to China or to Thailand, probably. We can, as I see it, for most people, they are going to be working in in-person services in the future. And we could have a Walmartized in-person service sector, paying minimum wages to people to care and sedate your parents and not keep them in good shape, to pick up your garbage, to redesign your kitchens in a very unskilled way. Or you can have what I call a new artisanal economy, an economy with a bunch of professional people who have pride in their work, who actually understand aging, and the medical and biological issues, and provide dignity and care, and have professional jobs, who help you think about idiosyncratically redesigning your kitchen, who really work seriously, whether it's in a security position or others. And the future is largely going to depend on the education and the incentives to reorganize work in the service sector in ways that create jobs that really are high quality jobs. We will need a very strong traded goods sector, but given the trajectory of technology, it's not going to be one that's going to employ a ton of people except for designers, engineers, top-end talent. But we need to use that to have the complementary services in hubs and things Ed has written about in cities with highly educated workforces. That's a potential positive future, but it requires education system, a tax system, and then the ability of workers to sort of put a little more bargaining clout in places where the services are not so footloose as in traded goods.
Ed, and then I'm going to finish with you, Ken.
I agree strongly with almost all of what Larry said. I think that actually education is key, and it's central. And thinking about how to deliver innovative forms of schooling to people in disadvantaged areas there's nothing more important for our government to do. And yes, we certainly need to have tax spending to do that. We need to fight against the unfortunate inequality that comes from our very structure of decentralized schooling in this country, right? By having the system where every local town is responsible for their own schools, in a world in which we have tremendous sorting by income across the United States, and sorting that has only increased over time, we create more and more isolation of the poor in the schooling system. Now, I think it's time to radically rethink that system and to think about ways in which we can deliver schooling in a way that channels more innovation, that channels more opportunity, that allows more creativity. I think that charter schools are one part of that, but they're only one part of that, and they never will be a substitute for a robust public school system. I would say the slight debate, and it's only a very slight debate over the minimum wage issue, is not that I differ in any sense from making sure that all workers earn a decent living, but I am very adamant against the dangers of putting any barriers against people with less resources working. So if you told me we were going to fund a minimum wage with a tax on the 1/10 of 1%, and we're just going to top up the wages in some hyped-up EITC in a way that tax is going to pay for it.
A tax credit for
tax
working
credit
people.
for the worker. So the worker is going to get whatever your minimum wage is, but it's not going to be paid for by the employer. Then I'm much more open to that than saying that we're going to radically increase the minimum wage and create a potential barrier to employing those workers. But I would just like to interject a note of, I don't know, we hardly need any notes of skepticism or cynicism, but about 7 years ago, I wrote a book on why the U.S. doesn't have a European-style welfare state. And I don't see, and together with Alberto Alesina, I argue that the combination of American ethnic fragmentation, which is so strongly associated with lower levels of redistribution across the world, and American political institutions, which are so geared against allowing sort of the radical change that created the European welfare states, that combination is still very much in place. And should I think is a barrier to all of those who wish the U.S. would transition to something that looked more like Sweden, and I don't think that's likely to change anytime soon.
Kathy?
You know, I'm going to sort of capitalize on this point about education. I've done a lot of work for many years in Camden, New Jersey. Was there 2 weeks ago. Visited a group of 8th graders in a school that was 130 years old. Holes in the roof, unbelievable. You walked outside, you were 2 blocks away from a trash incinerator that made it difficult to breathe. Not only have we not invested the way we used to, we are in serious trouble in terms of the kind of quality education we're offering our children. There's some really promising, although small, bits of hope, I think, in the evaluation literature about everything from high-quality preschool to higher-quality, smaller high schools. I'm talking about peri-preschool, Head Start, and career academies, which actually show large, significant family effects years later. So in both peri-preschool and in career academies, a young man's chances of actually raising his children in his own home are much, much higher, simply from creating a decent preschool and a more organized, career-themed, work-focused high school experience for disadvantaged young people. So perhaps there are real benefits to just investing in making sure our basic institutions are decent.
Could I just add one thing that relates to Harvard University?
Seems
you know,
appropriate.
increases in income inequality lead to increases in social inequality, and you see this in differences in college and university enrollment, including access to elite institutions like Harvard. Well, Harvard University initiated a program a few years ago that would provide full or almost full scholarships to many middle and lower income students who are admitted. And that set off a chain reaction as a number of other elite universities around the country followed suit with similar programs. And there is now much greater diversity at places like Harvard than there was a few years ago. So I think we should clap our hands, you know, and I really do think we have a very, very good program to encourage bright young people to come to Harvard. And you see them in the classroom, and it really does improve the overall intellectual atmosphere here.
And Drew is a leader in that, so thank you, Drew, for that effort. So I'm going to give Larry the last word. We're going to now open up the microphones. There are 4 microphones here, one right over there, one right over there, one there, and one there. Line up, and we'll go to that. So, Larry?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing related to the issues about some of the politics and we have and schools. We have a lot of models of successful pilots, whether it's charter schools and career academies and others, as Kathy said, and a lot of really dysfunctional school districts which need sort of changes in. There's a very interesting, I think, which makes the politics sort of very difficult issue, that if you look back when the U.S. school system was sort of the best in the world and we were expanding, in the first half of the 20th century, and you look at this very decentralized system, Ed talked about community by community, there was a very strong positive relationship between the share of elderly individuals or people over 50 and how much funding and how effective a school district was. Today, we have a growing, aging society. We have very different ethnic composition of young people in school and of older people who are taxpayers, and there's now a strongly negative relationship between school funding and the age structure, the share elderly in a community or a state, and it's particularly negative when the ethnic composition of the elderly voters, median voters, are different than the students in the school. And I think that is a huge, the competition of resources, age structure differences is a huge political problem that I don't think we know yet how to deal with, but is really, if you look across states where things are really falling apart, California used to be a leader, now it's a disaster in education, is almost a perfect case study of the changes in the demographics of who are the taxpayers and who are the students.
And an initiative or two. I just want to summarize a couple of things I've heard here because I think it's interesting and it's in part reflects the panel, but it is striking that this panel did not focus on the top 1% except as a source of revenue to work on a set of problems that were more in the bottom half. And it seems to me that's really, and thinking about institutions that support folks as they try and work, as they try and get ahead, as they try and play the rules and so forth. And it has profound implications not only for their own consumption, but for their families, for other kinds of things. I would just add one other point, which is kind of bugaboo for me, that, all of these discussions end up emphasizing education, and I want to add to that. I think education is absolutely essential and so forth. But do remember that if we invented a bill tonight, that every child born in America would suddenly get a great education, be able to take advantage of whatever that is, that first child would be out in the market in about 20 years. Can we wait 20 years for the perfect pill? And by the way, we can't get there. We haven't invented the pill yet. So we can't focus exclusively on that. That's got to be, there are many other ways, and we have to figure out ways so that people, when they get their first job, can find a next job. Welfare reform, which I was intimately involved in, the hope was we'd get a lot more people off of traditional welfare into the job market. And speaking of ladders, that would be the first step in a ladder. People would start moving up. Well, it turned out it wasn't so hard to get a lot more people working, and in so doing, they earned a little more money. What didn't happen was that they started walking up a ladder. It turned out to be a platform. And there's another huge challenge, one that all of you need to work on, and that's not easy in a world where the jobs are becoming shorter, less connected. You no longer can work up your way in most organizations. How do we create genuine job ladders so the woman that is starting as a home health aide worker can then work in a continuous care or nursing home, which, by the way, is a better paying jobs for which there's almost no mobility? How do you find ways to create the American dream, which was really that, not just that it wasn't that you found a job, is that if you worked hard, you'd do well, you'd do better, and your kids could do even better. And I think that's what's lost right now in this setting. And so we can't sit on the next magic bullet for education alone. We have to think about existing working families and what we do for them. So sorry for the violating my moderator rule. Let me start right here and remind people about what a good question at the Kennedy School is. A good question consists of 3 elements. 1, you identify yourself. And 2, particularly important tonight, it involves a short and single thought. And 3rd, it ends with a question mark. So with that, why don't we start right here?
My name is Rory Smith. I'm a visiting special student at the Graduate School of Arts and Science. The New York Review of Books journalist Tony Judt wrote a book before he died called Ill Fares the Land, which is something of an elegy for the rising tide period that you've talked about. But one of the points he highlights, and maybe this does relate more to the 1%, is that in his view, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, young up-and-coming people, the sort of people that might be at Harvard today, wanted to do interesting jobs, and they had different incentive structures, in his view, which weren't just related to money. I accept that the money incentivizer has always been there as a driver for jobs and success, but I wonder what you thought about the role of education in perhaps changing those incentive structures a bit to maybe take those 5 million, 10 million and redistribute it in another way.
I'll tell you what I gave my last lecture to my class of Harvard undergraduate economics concentrators today, and I told them that they should never undervalue their time and should never overvalue money. That in fact they're very special people and have a remarkable ability to reshape the world, and that shouldn't be lost in whatever else they're going after. So I think it is incumbent for us to make sure that we inculcate values that are commensurate with our intellectual mission.
Others want to add?
I would just add, I've actually been doing surveys of Harvard alums who left in the 60s and 70s, 80s, and 90s, and there certainly were substantial changes in what they decided to do. So as a factual matter, only about 5% of the class graduating in the early 70s was going into finance versus about 18% in the 90s versus if you do consulting and finance, about 40% today who start jobs. Part of that, some of that is values, but part of it is what's happening in the market. If you went to boring banking in the 1970s, you lived a good life, but you didn't earn that much more than a lawyer, a physician, even a teacher. Today, if you look at people 15 years out who went into finance, who have the same GPA, same SAT scores, who went to Harvard, who went into finance, they more than triple their income. So the economic incentives, we need to go on the values, but it's tough to go against that huge economic incentive facing people.
And is there anything we could do to change that? I mean, we hear this all the time. Here we are at the Kennedy School. There are a fair number of people that choose not to go that route or think of that as just one alternative, and they want to make the world a better place in a variety of ways. How do you deal with that? That's a bunch of market forces. It's a bunch of cultural forces, whatever. How do I think about that?
Bill, this one's for you.
You don't believe in asking tough questions, do you?
Hey, I'm the moderator.
No, I'm going to pass.
Ed?
I think the best we can. I mean, we can't change the earnings in our classrooms. I think the best we can do is to make the case for none of us here chose our jobs because of their earnings, right? And we have had, I think I can speak for most of us, enormously fulfilling lives that are just, and we are making it clear how blessed we are to have had those opportunities. Is
right. So we can see, despite those opportunities, in fact, a substantial number don't. And I think if you look at the stuff that we have done, which looking at people's life satisfaction and their more qualitative stuff, I think you can make a case that people have lived very fulfilled lives who didn't always move. And there were also a lot of divorces and other things in that group taking the money. But I think it's tough. It's a tough sell, but as educators, I think we have to make it. And you do actually see people are willing to take much lower incomes. If you look at postdocs, say in the biological sciences, there's a very nice study, who have multiple job offers, some more corporate where they have to do other people's work, but they're going to make a lot more money, others where they actually get to do their own science. People are willing to take $150,000 less a year as starting salaries to do their own sciences who have come out of places like this. So I think we can move in that direction.
Yeah, the important thing is to make your classes exciting, get these kids interested in pursuing careers that address problems of inequality in society. A lot depends on how exciting you make your classes. I don't know how you can go beyond that.
I think this has also actually been something Drew has focused on. Is this, I think what higher education can teach you is life is a quest for meaning, not money. They can be related, sometimes directly, sometimes inversely. Right up there.
Thank you all for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. My name is Alex Way. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I wanted to follow up on 2 points that were made this evening. One, the European welfare states may not be within our reach at this moment, and two, we're not doing a very good job of building career ladders inside of our companies. So I'm wondering whether we need to start focusing more on practices inside of businesses as a way to reduce inequality. I'm thinking about how we attack thoughts about the shareholder value doctrine, or also thinking about cooperative businesses as a means to change the way that economic production is organized and provide ways for people to have meaningful work. I'm wondering if any of you might share your thoughts on those themes.
We're going to talk about Middle East peace instead.
On the second one, I don't know. I'll let Ed talk about European welfare states in the U.S. I think that it's probably not realistic to think about a brief period in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s where people largely spent their careers in one firm in a long-term job with well-defined, large companies, corporate ladders. We need ways of having, companies can do a much better job of investing in human capital as a worker and keeping them, but most people are going to go through multiple types of jobs, and really what we need are a set of skills and adaptability so that you're attractive on the outside market as well as within a given company. And that's where I think, a lot of the issues have arisen in some. There are these wonderful training program evaluations that show very good effects of getting into first jobs, as David said. But one of the difficulties is once you cross company boundaries, it's very tough even to do an evaluation of a program that wants a job ladder from starting jobs in one place, say home health care, into sort of another one. You can't even get companies to volunteer to be part of such programs because it's so distinctive. So I think, it's going to end up being much more on the set of skills workers have and their willingness to invest in themselves, and creating that sort of talent that companies want to invest and keep them and retain them because they have good outside options. I think it's going to be much tougher to change the economic incentives companies have except that way.
I have a question. We're looking at the eroding strength of the nation's equalizing institutions. That means we give up. That means that we don't address the problems of public education, that we don't address the problems of comprehensive health coverage, that we don't address the problems of inadequate minimum wages. I mean, do we just simply throw up our hands in despair and not strengthen these institutions that have been so important in improving the lives of disadvantaged people or lower income people, or even middle income people for that matter?
Okay, right over here.
I mean, you're not going to respond? Are
you asking me?
Right, I'm talking about people on the panel. Do we?
Oh, sorry.
So we just give
I thought it
up.
was a rhetorical question.
So,
A very good one at that.
So
Right.
I would, I think we need, I believe we need to strengthen the institutions that have, buffeted market forces and have complemented them. I think it would be as I said, I think it would be very tough to build a strong traditional union movement, and it wouldn't be terribly relevant in the current traded goods sector. One, there are not a lot of jobs that are going to be there. Two, this really is footloose. In the in-person service sector, I think we do need to make it much easier to form a union, and we need to think of reforming labor law in ways of having things more like European works councils that give people voice in the workplace without having to have a traditional union, even though that's anathema to traditional unions in the U.S. I do think there are other models out there, and I suspect the model that will be out there isn't one we've currently thought of, but I don't think a return to exactly what was there in the 50s and 60s.
No, I don't think so
I
either.
I think minimum wages will play a role, but only in complement with things to upgrade the skills and create demand there. And I think a well-functioning earned income tax credit is probably going to do more good in the long haul than working it through the minimum wage.
I don't think either. I don't think anyone on this table at this group has talked about giving up in any sense. It's a question of what we think will be the smart approaches to create a nation of equality and opportunity. I think one of the great, it's enormously difficult to think about causing reconfigurations of the corporation and asking corporations to, go against what's fundamentally their fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value. I mean, that's a very hard thing to move against. But it is crucial that we think about not just changing the skill levels of the people who are now 3 or younger, but also to think about how we're going to enable people to become more skilled in middle life. And some of that may involve community colleges, some of that may involve delivery models involving new technologies that we haven't thought about yet, and some of it may involve well-designed economic policies that change the incentives to invest slightly in older people's human capital. All of these things are, I think, possibilities, and we should never give up fighting on these.
My own view, Bill, is that we ought to be focused not on, you called it equalizing, I like it, but I really want mobility-enhancing strategies.
Okay.
And
Public education would be a
absolutely, as
mobility-enhancing
community
strategy.
colleges would be amazing. I think there are a variety of structures to try and think about how you create genuine mobility for a 43-year-old, not just someone who's just starting at the school level. I think those are the kinds of questions we should be asking. Instead, we're preoccupied with a lot of stuff at the margins sometimes, and so. I've always supported a higher minimum wage, but I don't think that creates mobility. We've tried getting people up to a slightly higher paid job. I think we got to find ways to really make work pay and to really make working pay off even more in the future. Right over here.
Hi, I'm Manoa Coletti. I'm an MPAID here at the Kennedy School and also a graduate of Harvard College. My question is for Professor Glazer. You described some of the contours of the inequality problem as a loosening of regulation without a simultaneous movement to focus on investment in human capital for lower-income Americans. Arguably, some of the friction allowing one to continue existing without the other comes as rhetoric that justifies current tax and fiscal stances with faulty economic thinking. Firstly, how does this persist? And secondly, how does the collective voice of America's elite economists coalesce more powerfully to guide policy? Thanks.
I think this is absolutely crucial, and I think it is important that economists not just be voices for, fighting against certain policies that some of us may think are mistaken, but also fighting for policies that will actually have a larger impact on creating a society that's fair to all. I think one of the key things, rhetorically, and shall we say even making this sales pitch for America, is to make the case that this is not just about inequality and not even just about opportunity, but it's about the future of our nation. It's about the future of the strength of America, which will rise or fall on our human capital. And it is not just a tragedy for a person if they don't manage to figure out how to get the skills to succeed in the modern economy. It's a tragedy for all of us, because we all benefit from each other. And indeed, the horrendous losses that happen when a fifth of America isn't able to fulfill that potential, that loss is felt by all of us. And that's part of a national curse for our economy and for our society as a whole.
Right over here.
My name is Joe Davey. I'm a professor of law and justice at Rowan University of New Jersey. My question for the whole panel concerns the outsourcing of middle-class, college-educated jobs offshore. And I would point out that China, 10 years ago, graduated about 1 million people, and this year they're on target for 7 million people. India is not far behind, and those people work for about 15% of what our college graduates. You talked about the middle class and the hollowing out of the middle class. How do you stop those jobs from being digitized? Alan Blinder of Princeton says 40 million such jobs could be on their way to Asia in the next 20 years.
Well, I think the answer is you can't stop those jobs from being digitized. The big questions going forward are what we want is essentially for our workers to be complements to things done. This does not need to be a zero-sum game where we are just battling over this job or that job with India or China. We would like a progress where we have a strong core of well-trained, creative individuals who basically keep the high end of those jobs and complement with creating opportunities in China and India, and the big issue is we're certainly going to see a continued erosion of what have been, and moving up the food chain, what have been very routine sort of middle class, both white collar and production jobs. But the key is, there are many cases where the outsourcing of certain tasks free up people to do the more imaginative and creative tasks. And so we need to have the strong infrastructure that involves energy policy, it involves transportation, and we need to have the strong education. And I think the things the U.S. has a real strength in are sort of entrepreneurship and strong research universities, and that's actually going to be a key part of keeping the high value-added jobs. There's some very nice research that one of our former students, Naomi Hausman, is now a postdoc here, has done, looking at the incentives to commercialize research done at universities with the Dole-Hatch Act, or Hatch-Dole Act in the early 80s, and very much related to work Ed has done. There are huge spillover benefits of the interactions between universities and these sort of new technologies. And the life cycle of it is in the short medium run, you create a hub, which is where whether it's Austin, Texas, Cambridge, Route 128, and others, of tremendous job creation of high value-added jobs. Eventually, those things spin off and work gets outsourced. But we need to keep at the leading edge there, and that's going to involve investing in universities and in research and in having essentially the ability for new firms to start up. And in this downturn, what's really been shocking in the lack of job growth has been the lack of new startups, which have been our engine of providing those types of jobs, which have to do with the capital market and research funding, and that's what's really shockingly. So we're not going to win by cutting off the ability to outsource. This isn't a win-lose. We're going to succeed if we have the infrastructure, the universities, and the talent such that we keep on generating the new generation of the higher value-added jobs, and it should be win-win. Certainly some of it has not been in the short run.
Right here.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Professor Eden, for highlighting the importance of marriage. With the repeal or potential repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act and the increasing support of gay marriage, I wanted to hear the panel's thoughts on economic social policies that favor the institution of marriage.
Daddy.
I think that's, I will say that in Europe, their cohabitations last as long as our marriages. So marriage is just the way that Americans happen to stay together, okay? So it's not marriage per se, but it's the staying together part that really benefits kids. And we don't know how to stay together outside of marriage, which is why I emphasized it. Some of us do, but not very many. Maybe I'm depressing some of you in this room. But I think we do know about how to shore up the relationships of low-income couples who have kids. I mean, these family situations are just extraordinarily complex. I put up charts in my classes. Many of my students are here, and we stare at them and we think, what kind of institutional arrangements could even respond to families of this kind of complexity? But modest economic improvements have really shown some movement. So in the Minnesota Family Investment Program, modest wage supplements for low-wage workers who were on welfare led to reductions in divorce among low-income married families. You saw slight increases in marriage in the New Hope experiment, which is also a wage supplement. And then again, as I said, in the Fragile Families Survey, where you can follow couples over time, you see the probability of marriage can be moved by increases in one's economic fortunes. So an expanded earned income tax credit, I'm all for. I've spent the last 4 or 5 years with some students studying the one we've got now. It's terrific, but it doesn't pay enough, and families still can't make ends meet. So,
Bill? All right, great. Thank you.
All right. Good evening. My name is Alex Smith. I'm a freshman here at the college. I just wanted to ask the panel to comment on a sort of conflict that I detected between movement toward getting a lot of students through college, but also a movement to increase these sort of face-to-face jobs. I know there's a growing movement I've heard of where to sort of put people precisely where they belong. So if someone's a brilliant auto mechanic, we wouldn't want them to go through Harvard and get skills that they necessarily weren't fitted to. So with sort of with as we addressed earlier with outsourcing, are we moving toward a situation where everyone in America will need a college education, or should we still put some effort into nurturing those face-to-face jobs that are sort of eroding as we outsource them?
Well, I think ideally everyone in the U.S. should have the opportunity to go to post-secondary education, which can be liberal arts education. It could be a mix of liberal arts education and a set of skills. In fact, you can't actually be an auto mechanic today by just playing around with cars, in your garage. You actually have to understand electricity, and the models are updated so rapidly it does require a lot of retraining, and many community colleges as well as many for-profit institutions are required, and there is really no economic future without some amount of post-secondary schooling. And I personally think it needs to be mixed with strong liberal arts, because those are the flexible skills that are going to be valuable, and you're not necessarily just going to be an auto mechanic forever. But a big issue going forward, though, is if you look at community colleges in the U.S., they're hugely overrun. The state budgets are very difficult. The vast majority are doing general studies, even though the returns seem much higher for doing things like a health technician, like an auto mechanic. And one of the big reasons they don't provide many of that is their big fixed cost to setting up instruction in those areas. And while they get funding on the number of students in the short run, states are very scrapped for providing the infrastructure for setting up a nursing program, for setting up an auto mechanics thing. And what's happened is there's been this nimble force, the for-profit higher education sector, which has come in there, some of them very good, but many of them are charging $20,000 in tuition, 90% funded by federal loans and Pell Grants with huge default rates. We would be much better off if we were better investing in the infrastructure of community colleges to compete, I think, than going in that model, which has not worked as well as it could.
Or at least making the Pell Grants more contingent on actual skill
Oh, yeah.
creation, right?
We
I mean,
need to have
that's the...
Right over here. By the way, we're going to have time for just 2 more questions.
Wonderful, thank you. My name is Victor Sedano, and I'm an MPP1 here at the Kennedy School. I know that we've mainly focused on economic issues today, but I continue to hear from the Occupy movement all over the country. They don't feel that they're being represented by either party in Washington. And so my question is about inequality and democracy. Can they coexist? And as a democracy, is inequality something that we ought to be focused on, or should we simply focus on how the worse off are doing? I see that there's a difference between the two, and you've touched on that today.
That the Occupy Wall Street movement has done, I think, very effectively, and it has raised the awareness of inequality, income inequality, and social inequality in American society. The reason that's important is that you can't address a problem like the rising inequality unless you're fully aware that it exists. And you can't make wise decisions if you don't have good information. And I think that for the first time, I think that there's a real possibility that a public discussion about rising inequality is going to take place. In fact, it's taking place already because of the Occupy Wall Street. That's what I see as the major contribution of Occupy Wall Street, creating an awareness of income and social inequality in the United States.
One of the things that this issue of representation emphasizes the importance of political institutions in shaping different countries. The majoritarian system of American government will always tend towards the middle, right? And no matter what President Obama may have said on the campaign trail, he both, as the Democratic candidate, he has to run to the middle and he has to govern to the middle. It's the way our institutions are set up. How different that is from a system of proportional representation, which is one that very much empowers people from all sorts of different groups, which is in part why, for 120 years, relatively social democratic groups championed proportional representation. And indeed, across countries in the world, there's a strong correlation between the amount of proportional representation and the share of GDP spent on social welfare spending. So I think this comment does, in fact, highlight the long-run importance of various forms of political institutions in terms of shaping the contours of the social welfare state.
But I do think that's a great question, a question for another panel. But fundamentally, the question of why democracy doesn't seem to be working very well. I don't think anybody's very happy with the institutions at this stage. And how do you deal with the many different issues that make it? And another point, I think part of what the panel is saying is we should be at least spending a fair amount of time thinking about how we create the kinds of society and mobility that we're after, as opposed to fighting about, issues around tax policy at the
David,
top.
could I raise one other point? This question also reminds me that the Occupy Wall Street movement has made us aware that there is an association between income inequality and civic engagement, political participation, political behavior, and so on. We haven't talked about that tonight, but that's a very, very important topic when you're talking about inequality in American society.
This will be the last question.
I almost feel apologetic for asking a question, because I think that maybe we should have ended on that last one, because my question was much more discreet. David Murphy from the Harvard Institute of Learning and Retirement. I think it's really for Professor Katz. If the fundamental dynamic of the last 40 years has been globalization and technology change, which has driven devalued labor, basically, on a global scale. And you've talked about the attempt to remedy that by generating high value, going to high value, and that's what everyone always says. Is there going to be demand? Are we confident there's going to be demand for things that those high value jobs do?
Yeah, so I think yes, there is no limit to imagination and ability to produce things, whether it's an iPhone or a three-dimensional copying technology. So I think there are two key points here. One, it's very important to have a strong traded goods sector, which is high value added and imaginative. That's not going to be where the majority of employment is going to come from. It's going to be a big driver of the economy, a big share of GDP, but it's not, but it's also going to be very technology and, what's going to be big is it's going to create, ideally, hubs of all sorts of demand for service jobs around them. And the big question, one is having that strong thing driving, national growth, but then will we sort of invest in the type of high value added service jobs, whether it's in health, whether it is in parts of things that need to be done in construction, or whether it's in auto repair or redesigning. Those are going to be the big parts of employment where the typical worker is going to work. They will have lots of income and potential driven from a well-functioning trade goods, and we need that to be able to afford things overseas. But one shouldn't think of most people. We're not going to go back to an era of the 1950s where a third of the workforce is working in manufacturing. It'll still be a third of GDP probably.
And the critical thing is finding the entrepreneurial energy to figure out the new opportunities for all of America. I do want to just say one thing about the global devaluation of labor that you mentioned, which I think is important. It is critical to remember that at a global scale, inequality actually isn't rising, it's declining, right? Yep. That in fact, the great increase of wealth in places like India and China are actually making the world a somewhat more equal rather than less equal place. And that is in no sense meant to minimize the incredible importance of dealing with our own issues of inequality here in this country. But let's not also forget that the global trade is actually accomplishing something good as well, and not to forget that side of the coin at the same time.
So I want to give people a chance to have a last word. Ed, was that your last word?
That's my last word,
okay,
absolutely.
Bill?
No, I just wish that we had the opportunity to focus more on the association between income inequality and political behavior. I think one of the reasons why we have such polarization in our society today with respect to politics is because, groups are so separated that there's no longer a sense of community where we come together and address issues that affect the common good. People are separated and they're looking at their own narrow interests. And I think this is an issue that really needs more discussion. Rising inequality has contributed to, I maintain, the political polarization of American politics today.
Kathy?
I agree that we're just desperate for a values change. And I think in order for that to happen, we need a social movement.
Yeah, I would just leave, by saying that, if one puts in a longer-term historical perspective, there have been periods of large increases of inequality in the past. When Edward Bellamy was writing Looking Backward and James Bryce was observing the United States in the late 19th century, people were talking about robber barons and the trust. Louis Brandeis in the early 20th century was writing about other people's money and the interlocking directorates of finance. There was a progressive movement. It came about from, not actually, there were immigrant groups, but also a lot of middle-class educated people at that time seeing what was happening at the very top. And that's where I think the top 1% and Wall Street could be a galvanizing point of movement and opening up the eyes. It really was the local real estate broker, teacher, and physician seeing the large money and influence in politics, whether it was political machines at the local level or the Millionaires Club in the Senate, that led to reform movements under Teddy Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson that really changed, brought in things from the FDA to antitrust. That doesn't mean we're going to have the same regulatory response, but I do think this has happened before. It doesn't, it was many decades for such a movement to take place, but I wouldn't, the politics is tough, but there was just as much relative money in politics in the late 19th, early 20th century. And hopefully it won't take a full Great Depression and World War II to do it this time. But I think history does give us some guidance that these things take a while, but with enough commitment, one can overcome them.
So I'm hearing that we've always been buffeted by markets and changing technologies and all that sort of thing. And it really is in your hands and in our hands to find the new institutions and the new strategies that will reinvigorate the American dream as opposed to watching it decay. So I want to thank the panel. It's been a terrific evening. Thank you all for coming, and have a safe evening.